Hi, and welcome to Boring Things Made Fun. I'm Chris, and I'm going to explain to you how this would turn into this, which would turn into this.
Is this where you take history and make us analyze it for a deeper meaning?
No, but I'm hoping to take what you find boring and make it interesting. Today I'm going to talk about the 100 Years' War, which is a long and ugly conflict in which England and France duked it out to decide whose men 21st century women would find more attractive. And less importantly, they fought over whether England had a claim to the French throne. Now, before I get started explaining why the war took place, let me first explain a little something about medieval war culture. Wars in this time were usually fought by peasants who, under the feudal system, were conscripted by lords to fight their wars for them. They were usually waged over things like claims to nobility and that jerkish comment at the last dinner party. These wars were usually very bloody, but like most wars until World War II, most of those who died outside of combat, of nasty things like dysentery and Black Plague. At times, entire armies could be wiped out by bad cold.
So what was the war even about?
Well, Ben, the 100 Years' War was not truly a war in the sense that we modern people know it, in that it had breaks up to 10 years in which there were truces that both parties would eventually find reasons to violate. Also, the 100 Years' War should not be called the 100 Years' War, but rather the 116 Years' War, but that doesn't sound nearly as cool. It all started when William the Conqueror took the throne of England in 1066, while retaining his position as Duke of Normandy. This little loophole forced the English kings that succeeded him to pay homage to the King of France in the form of major monetary contributions and a public swearing of allegiance. But like most of history, it was only a matter of time before someone decided to go against the tide. This rebellious upstart was English King William III. The result of his refusal to pay homage was that the French king at the time, Philip VI, got seriously mad and confiscated Edward's lands in Aquitaine, in southwest France. Edward, like any logical king would do, responded by declaring that he was the true ruler of France, using a succession justification that we won't get into here because it's boring and unimportant, except for the fact that Edward seriously thought he was the French king, which obviously pissed Philip VI off and ultimately led to the war. Now pay attention, because this is where things get really confusing. The war was actually a series of 3 dynastic conflicts in which there were intermediate breaks that brought about some pretty useless peace truces. The first phase of the war was what is commonly referred to as the Edwardian era war, which saw massive and ugly battles like the Battle of Crécy, in which the English beat the living shit out of the French. Next was the Caroline War, in which the French beat the living shit out of the English. Finally, to end it, was the Lancastrian War, in which the French and English beat the living shit out of each other. We were introduced to one of history's great female figures, and English would first begin to flash the V for victory sign that would become the symbol of photographs of Churchill, Nixon, and Asian tourists. It is worth noting that the 100 Years' War was also tied into wars that were happening, particularly in Spain, like the War of the Two Peters and the Castilian Civil War. I'm mostly going to be talking about the Lancastrian War because it gave us people like Henry V and Joan of Arc, who would later go on to make great Shakespeare characters. It was also the last phase of the war in which the French, having experienced setback after setback, were eventually saved by a French peasant girl who had a couple of weird dreams, and then was burned for them. However, I will discuss the other phases in some detail. The Edwardian era was the first phase of the 100 Years' War. It is named for a man who has a strong argument for having been the person who started it when he began to act like he had French sovereignty. Thanks to major victories at Crécy and Poitiers, the Edwardian phase was largely an English victory and led to the treaty in 1360. The treaty gave Edward III a huge chunk of land in France that included Guyenne and Gascony, without having to pay the homage to any of the lands. It also lasted in the 9-year peace, which would be interrupted by the start of the Caroline War. Yes, Ben.
Is that like that Neil Diamond song, like, Sweet Caroline or something?
No, Ben.
Sweet.
Shut up, Ben. The Caroline War was named after French King Charles V. It began when the Black Prince, son of Edward III, refused to pay summons to Paris demanded by Charles V, who responded by breaking the treaty and restarting the war, but this time with the Crown of Aragon backing him up. The conflict was mostly a stalemate until the reign of Richard II, who wasn't very good at warfare, and wasn't very good at anything in general. Under Richard II, England was forced to sign another truce that was favorable towards the French, and it wasn't until Richard was deposed by Henry Bolingbroke that the English were able to reclaim their lands. The Lancastrian War would be famous because of Shakespeare's huge coverage in its historical plays. It started when Henry V of England teamed up with Burgundy and invaded Normandy in 1415, and led his armies to the Siege of Harfleur and the Battle of Agincourt. Both victories, though, placed England in a position of major power in the conflict. Henry V, along with the Duke of Burgundy, forced King Charles VI to marry his daughter, Catherine of Law, to Henry, thus making so Henry's son would be the heir to the French throne. For a while, things seemed fine until the Battle of Bruges in 1421, in which an English army of 10,000 was defeated by a Franco-Scottish army of 6,000. The situation was made worse by Henry V's death. His young son Henry VI was crowned King of England and France. A French faction known as the Argomacs did not acknowledge Henry VI and stayed loyal to Charles VI's son, Charles Dauphin, not Dolphin, thus continuing the war. In 1428, the English were out starting trouble again, laying siege to Orleans with an undersized army. Meanwhile, a peasant girl by the name of Joan of Arc had convinced Dauphin to let her lead the armies of France at the siege. The French army, inspired by Joan, managed to lift the siege that would later lead to a number of other major English losses, like the ones at Patay and Castellane. The English would lose this phase, and by extension the war, giving France the freedom to no longer worry about English invasions, and England the time to find something else to fight about. Now, the 100 Years' War was important for more than just a reason that it was a big damn war and that it took a really long time to fight. It was important in that it not only led to a major military and technological developments, but also led into dynastic turmoil in England that would later be called the War of the Roses, the Tudor dynasty, eventually the split of England from the Catholic Church. It would lead to an increased use of longbows and light cavalry and the decline of usage of armored knights and heavy cavalry as military advancements during the war had found ways to easily defeat armored troops. Also, after the war, England would find itself in the middle of a domestic dynastic upheaval that would end in the end of the York and Lancastrian dynasties, and the beginning of the Tudor dynastic line, which included famous monarchs like Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. The main hope for this episode is you come out of it learning how a war that takes place in another country can still cause turmoil on the home front, and in some cases completely warp the way people wage war and settle dynastic disputes.